to Lemonade. I'm Carrie and I am here to share with you another money saving tip. I have been getting into canning lately because it's just a great way to save food without filling up the freezer completely, and then if your power ever goes out, everything in your freezer is lost. So what I've been doing is taking our meats and things from our freezer and thawing them out and then canning them, and that way they're shelf stable, which is really nice, and they'll last for quite a while that way. There's a lot of different ways and beliefs and tricks and stuff that people use for canning, but I'll show you how I do it. Lately I've been canning, like I said, mostly meats, but I also canned chili, soups, anything else like that too, vegetables, whatever you want to save and make it shelf stable. It's a great way to do it. And even if you're not really doing it to save it for a long term, it's nice to can up a bunch of stuff, and then for the next few weeks you've got meats that you can just dump into a pot, bring it up to a boil for 10 minutes, and then serve it with a side, and your dinner is done, which is fantastic, which is what's been happening with like these porks and things. Now when you can meat, I did this as like put the pork in raw and canned it this way, and it cooked for 90 minutes in a pressure cooker. As you can see, there's still fats and things in there. I can pull that out whenever I go to dump it out, or I can leave it in and let it cook in a pot for 10 minutes, bring it to a boil for that 10 minutes, and it just adds more flavor. But done the same thing with pork. I've done chicken. I did beef the other day as well. Same thing. Again, this makes for a great stock, the liquid that's in it for your next soups or whatever. But in the meantime, you've got slow cooked beef. And what's nice too is you can buy the cheaper cuts of meat. Like that beef was stew meat, but when you bite into it, it is so flavorful because it has been packed with all of its flavor, and it's been cooked for 90 minutes in a pressure cooker to keep that flavor in there. So it is the most tender, flavorful food. It's really good. So whether you're doing it because you find meat on sale and you want to just save some for later, if there's shortages and you find meat and you don't want to have to just potentially just keep it in your freezer forever, you can do this, and it's a great way. So I'm going to show you how. This was some pork I found at Walmart for a pretty cheap price, so I figured it would be a good candidate for canning on this project. So this is actually what's called raw packing method for canning. I'm taking cold raw meat, I'm cutting it into chunks, and I'm packing it tightly into my pint-sized jars. There are other ways to can meat. You could cook the meat first. You could partially cook the meat first. Like when I make chicken fajitas, I'll sear up the chicken on the outside and it'll still be raw on the inside, and I'll pack it into the jars. But whatever way you take, you need to make sure that you keep the temperatures consistent. This is cold meat, so it's going to go into a cold jar with cold lid, cold ring around the lid, and it's going to have cold water in the bottom of the canner. If I was using cooked meat fresh out of the oven or fresh out of the crock pot, I would make sure that those jars are hot to match that temperature, and that the water in the canner is hot and the lids and rings are hot, because if they're not, you run the risk of shattering your jars during this process. So this will be done with the raw pack method. I do like to, for certain things like ground beef, I like to cook that all up into like tomato sauce for spaghetti and things, and I'll can it that way. That's an example of when I would have hot jars with hot lids and hot water, because I take it right off the stove and I put it right into the jars, and it goes into the canner from there. So just remember, keep your temperature consistent with whatever method you go with. And you'll see I'm also cutting out some of the fat here, because when you do the raw pack method, if you have a lot of fat, sometimes that becomes a little too much in the jar for my liking anyway. Now you can absolutely put whatever seasonings you want with your food. I am making this more Puerto Rican in nature for flavor because I am married to a Puerto Rican, and my father-in-law is Puerto Rican, and our son has that palate too. So I'm putting in some adobo. I put in garlic powder and onion powder and a little bit of sazon Goya, which is their cilantro and anato seasoning. This recipe turns out really nice. It's super flavorful. It's very bold flavors. I like it, but you can season however you want. You could put vegetables in with your meats. You could put other herbs in. One thing I caution about is certain herbs, their flavors become very bold or even change when you're cooking. For example, if you put in fresh garlic, sometimes that might turn your food a little bit gray, which is why I use the garlic powder. Or something like sage can sometimes turn really bitter. So you want to maybe look up your seasonings before you commit. I'm using this funnel to help measure out everything as I put it into these jars. I'm using pint-sized jars. They're wonderful for what size I'm looking for because I can make them into small portions. It works out well, but you want to make sure that you leave what's called some headspace in those jars, and this funnel is for canning, and it's specifically helping me measure out enough space in the jar so that it's not too full. If you fill it all the way up to the top, while it's cooking, things expand and change, so it will leak out. It's called siphoning. It'll leak out of the jar's lids while it's canning, and sometimes that leaves oils and stuff between the lid and the jar, and that can stop it from sealing well. So it might go into your pantry and then suddenly pop open, and now your food's going bad or smelling and you didn't notice. So leaving enough headspace is key. Usually it's 1 inch. Next, I'm just taking some white vinegar and I'm cleaning the rims here of the jars before I put the lids on. Just making sure I don't have anything there gumming it up that's going to stop it from sealing properly. Alright, I'm breaking a rule here. I'm reusing some lids that I used previously. Some people would refuse to do this. You need to do it at your own risk if you decide to. But they're sanitized and ready to go. Only tighten these finger tight, because if it's too tight, you're going to have problems with the process. I happen to have some extra chicken in the freezer that I wanted to clear out, so I'm adding in some bouillon cubes and closing those up as well and getting them ready for the canner to go in at the same time as the pork. I'm using an all-American canner. It is really nice. It holds a good amount of jars inside of it. It comes with a tray at the bottom that the jars sit on, because if they sit flat on the bottom, the bottoms of the jars will break out eventually. So that helps protect them. It has a meter right here that's going to tell you a rough estimate of what pressure you're cooking at. And then this part over here is where your steam comes out, and there's a little jiggler weight that sits on there. And this is an emergency pop out for if the steam builds too much. It helps prevent any explosive situations. I'm filling up this canner to about 2 or 3 inches of water here at the bottom, and then I move this little tray just to make sure I didn't leave any air bubbles in there. And I go ahead and I'm going to start setting my jars in. Canners are expensive to buy brand new. In my case, I went in on this one with somebody else, so we share it back and forth because we wanted a really nice canner. But you can buy them at garage sales, thrift stores, things like that, and get a decent price on them. You just want to make sure that they have all of the parts and that they're working properly. All right, that's everybody in and ready to go. Trying to make sure they're not really touching each other or bumping up against the sides. I've turned my canner sideways because of where the steam hits my microwave. I don't want it to melt anything or damage it. You'll want to look up what pounds of pressure you need to be canning at. In my case, it's 10 pounds of pressure, so on this little jiggler weight, I will be using the 10-pound setting, and I will be placing it over where the steam is coming out momentarily. Now I've set everything on high heat and I'm letting it build up pressure. I'm not putting the weight on until I see this column of steam going for 10 straight minutes. So when you see that column of steam, set a timer for 10 minutes before you put on your weight. So I'm still at high heat, but now it's been 10 minutes of straight steam coming out. So here goes the weight on my 10 pounds of pressure. I'm going to let this keep heating up though until that weight starts to jiggle. Once it starts to jiggle, I can lower the heat down, and then I only want it to jiggle between 1 and 4 times per minute for the 75 minutes that it will take to can these pints of meat. If I was doing quarts of meat, it would be 90 minutes, but I'm only doing pints, so it's 75 minutes. There goes the jiggle. So I'm going to go ahead and lower the heat and let that kind of cool down just a little bit so it will jiggle like that only 1 to 4 times a minute instead of constantly, because I don't want to overdo the pressure. All right, it's been 75 minutes and everything should be done. So it's time for me to just simply turn off the heat. I don't want to move anything. I don't want to touch anything. I'm just turning off the heat and letting it slowly cool down, and this will take a while. Now I've waited until the meter has shown down to 0 pressure in there. So it's now safe to take off the jiggler, wait, but use a glove because there's still steam, as you can hear in there. And now it's time to set a timer for 2 minutes before we do anything else. All right, it's been 2 minutes. It's time to take off this lid and see what we've got. So I'm gonna open everything up kind of slowly here. I'm gonna go around, open each latch, and then I'm gonna tilt it away from me when I take the lid off, because if there happens to be just any steam or pressure still in there, I don't want it hitting me in the face. On a side note, I'm canning on a glass stovetop, and you need to check your manufacturer recommendations before you do this on a glass stovetop, just to make sure that your stovetop can handle it. All right, these are done. It's time to remove them. Be careful when you remove them, they're very hot. You don't want to tip them around a whole lot and mess up your seal. So I'm just gonna remove them. I'm gonna lift them out. I'm gonna move them right over onto a towel and let them sit there and cool because they are very hot. Here's everybody. They're still bubbling and boiling inside, and they will continue to do that for many hours, and that's very normal. Some people will cover them with a towel. Sometimes I do if my house feels pretty cold. It's a warm, sunny day, so I'm not bothering with it because our windows are all open, but they're gonna bubble like this for several hours, and you'll slowly hear them ping and seal. Well, it's the end of the day and the end of my canning project. So we've got our chicken and pork cooling. They're going to continue to bubble like that for a while. I am not going to touch them for 12 to 24 hours. The longer that you can wait to just let them sit and cool and do their thing, the better, because that just allows them to cool all the way. If you start moving them around ahead of time, you could lose the seal on them and they won't last, they'll go bad. So I don't tend to move them for anything. Everyone in the house has been instructed not to touch them. They just sit there. Once they're fully done and cool, I will then take a cloth with some soapy water and I will just carefully, I'll remove the rings around them, and then I will go ahead and just wipe them down really well and make sure there's no, food or oils or anything like that that got on there in the process, because when you store it, if you haven't done that, they could stick to your shelves or kind of just be a little messier or draw in bugs, which nobody wants to have in their house. So I will go ahead and get them wiped down tomorrow at that point, and then they should be just good to store. They'll last for quite a while, and generally anytime that I do canning, as soon as I open the jars to use them, again, I will let them boil for 10 minutes just to cook off any botulism toxins or anything like that. And not that I think there's anything in my food, but I'm just extra cautious. Some people don't do that at all, some people do. That's just my rule, so I make sure that I do that. That's just for the safety, and we've not been sick, so that works. But anyway, that is how we do our canning. If you have any questions, or if you have some recipes that you've canned that you really like, or any suggestions, please feel free to comment, and please like and subscribe so that way you don't miss the next video, and we'll see you later. Thanks, bye.